Hey everybody, it's Tuesday, February 11th, 7:49 p.m. I am Larry Wiggs. I'm your host at IC 109.
You're at 109 right now.
I'm going to begin with a well, actually, I'm not even going to begin. I'm just actually going to read from California's Black Pioneers. I'm going to read from this book, and I'm going to keep up this series. I'm going to just keep reading and recording and uploading until I'm finished with this book. So let's begin, shall we? First off, this is a book I found in the library at Dorsey High School. I found this book. I began reading it. I found some extremely interesting information in the book, and I wanted a copy of my own. So I searched and I found that I could purchase a copy, I believe, on Amazon. I believe it was Amazon. Let me check that out. Or maybe it was another bookstore. Anywho, yes, I don't know which bookstore it was. Sometimes I buy books on Amazon. Sometimes I buy them at Thrifty Books and Abe or Abe Books or wherever I can find books. So I found a copy. This was not cheap. This was a $50 book. I believe when it was printed originally, it was much cheaper, maybe about $10. It does not say the price is not listed on the book, so I cannot confer with the book. So anywho, this book was written in, or rather, it was published in 1973, and I believe the copy that I have is from a 1974 printing. All right. The first time I set out to read this book, which was just a few minutes ago, I read the back cover, and rather than do that, I'm just going to get right into it. Maybe I'll come back to the back cover and read it. But this is a Black History. This is a Black History moment for me because I'm reading about Black history. You know. All right, so let's get into it. This is the foreword of California's Black Pioneers: A Brief Historical Survey by Kenneth G. Goode, whom I presume is deceased. So the late Kenneth G. Goode, but his legacy lives on. All right. So here we go. Forward. This is a fascinating book for any conscientious student of American history or any reader seeking insights into the realities of American society now. It is a valuable book for scholars who need facts and careful analysis of the relationship between the adolescent state of California and the maturing nation of the United States. Above all, it is an enlightening book because it brings to life the many black men and women who played key roles in the growth of the dynamic state of California. Dr. Kenneth G. Goode's book can be read for both scholarly value and personal pleasure. His book is distinguished by the dual talents of rigorous scholarship and incisive writing. The events he narrates are not dull montages pasted together from old newspaper clippings. The people he describes in this book are not cast iron statues dwelling in intellectual parks. They are struggling human beings whose lives are made vivid to us on these pages. I can imagine no limit for interest in this book. Any American who is curious about what makes this country tick will value and enjoy it. Blacks and whites, scholars and students, Californians and Americans of any state will find a wealth of fact and drama in California's Black Pioneers: A Brief Historical Survey. One immense value of this book is that it offsets some of the stereotyped notions about the development of the American West. We learn that the United States was expanded to its western shore not just by white Anglo Saxon men infused with the spirit of President Polk's Manifest Destiny. We learn that black men were with such explorers as Ponce de Leon in the earliest discoveries of the American continent. We learn that in pre statehood days from 1831 to 1847, California had four black governors. We learn that blacks rode many of the 100-mile segments of the Pony Express. The black businessmen were commercially powerful in San Francisco and Los Angeles. That black men and women pioneered in all of the economic and social realms during the growth of California. Dr. Goode also realistically presents the grim side of the story of the role of blacks in California's history. We learn that black children were offered no schooling at all for a period after statehood, and that California held tenaciously to segregated schools for several decades after that. We learn that California lagged behind the national government in assuring constitutional rights and civil rights for blacks. We learn that racism was rampant even in the first decades of the present century. California's motion picture industry so totally discriminated against blacks, for example, that the first movie version of Uncle Tom's Cabin cast a white actor in the role of Uncle Tom. No black individual was elected to the state legislature until 1918. In that year, a black man narrowly defeated an incumbent white assemblyman whose campaign was based on this message printed on 1,000 cards: "My opponent is a nigger." There are two other impressive qualities in Dr. Goode's book which merit brief note in this foreword. First, his account of the role of blacks in California history is not narrowly focused on the struggle against injustice and discrimination. That struggle is effectively described, but is only part of the broader story. The many dimensions of the activities of black men and women are also described, from the relationships of blacks to the early pioneering of the American West to the involvement of blacks in the arts, the military, the labor movement, and business. Second, Dr. Goode does not paint the picture of black pioneers in California on a blank background. His book is all the more interesting and valuable because he relates the history of blacks in California to the total national scene. The reader's knowledge of the whole of American history is enriched by this book. The breadth of this book's material is also indicated by the time span covered. We are brought from the earliest primitive settlement of America and California and the role of blacks then to such recent political pioneering as the successful campaign of Tom Bradley in the 1973 mayoralty election in Los Angeles. Written history might be described as the selective assembling of past events which are of value and interest to contemporary readers. No single volume can relate the whole story of a place, an era, or a subject. The conscientious student of history must seek many sources to gain a rounded understanding of the past and educated insights into the present. The mosaic of American history has, until recent years, lacked some essential pieces, particularly those depicting the participation of blacks in the growth of the nation and its presently largest state. Dr. Goode has filled in a significant gap in the mosaic with California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey, written by Wilson Riles. All right, so that was the foreword taken from California's Black Pioneers, a brief historical survey by Kenneth, maybe Dr. Kenneth G. Goode, and forward by Wilson Riles. Okay. Now for the preface. All right. The preface. The incentive to write this book stems from the need to fill the many blanks in Afro American history. In his introduction to my first book, published 4 years ago, Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan of the University of California at Berkeley wrote, Black people in America have been robbed of many things. Among the most important has been their own history. Human beings need to know where they have been if they are to know where they are and where they are going. Today, Afro Americans, especially, can profit by learning about their forefathers, about the triumphs and tragedies that have marked their history. White Americans can also profit from learning about the Afro American dimension of American history. Indeed, it seems to me, as a white American historian, that it is impossible to comprehend American history as such without some knowledge of the history of Americans of African ancestry. Dr. Jordan's assessment of the importance to all Americans of Afro American history generally can certainly be applied to the history of black people in California. Several years ago, a report commissioned by the California State Board of Education and written by several historians on the faculty at UC Berkeley pointed out that blacks and other minorities were seriously underrepresented in the textbooks that were being used in California schools. Steps to correct this situation have been slow and almost imperceptible. Hopefully, this book will speed the process. I should like to acknowledge the contributions of the many persons rather, who aided me in this undertaking, among them Dr. James Hart, director of the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, Professor Charles Wollenberg of Laney College, Professor Rudolph M. Lapp, and Flora Meyerson of the University of Washington, Seattle, Elena Albert, San Francisco African American Historical and Cultural Society, C. Edward Pope, California Department of Parks and Recreation, and Robin Matsui and Lois Vaughn, who proofread and typed the manuscript. While these and many other people were helpful in the preparation of this book, let there be no doubt that all the errors, inferences, and conclusions contained herein are my own. Alrighty then. Now we begin the first chapter, the Spanish Era, 1769 to 1821. Although it has been suggested that black Africans and not Europeans were the first to discover America and penetrate into its interior, in order to understand fully the role blacks played in California's discovery, exploration, exploitation, and colonization, the historian must begin by examining Spain's interest in the New World and her quest for riches. When the forces unleashed by the Renaissance and the Commercial Revolution resulted in the breakdown of feudalism and the rise of powerful nation states of Europe, black Africans were not unfamiliar in the populations of countries in the Iberian Peninsula. For at least 1,000 years prior to 1492, the Carthaginians and Romans had maintained trade routes which linked black Africa with the Iberian Peninsula and introduced blacks into that area. The size and prosperity of the Roman city of Leptis Magna, close to modern Tripoli, can best be examined by the fact that it was located at the head of a major trans Saharan trade route running southward through the Fezzan. The Carthaginian settlement of Lixus on the Atlantic coast of Morocco was the terminus of a trade route across the Mauritian desert from Black Africa. Over these routes came gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, hides, slaves, and other items which were in demand throughout the Mediterranean world. The Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 700s led to a further introduction of black Africans into the Iberian Peninsula. However, it was not until the end of the 14th century that black Africans began to arrive in southern Europe in significant numbers. During this time, Spanish and Portuguese adventurers were exploring the west coast of Africa in the wake of the great wave of expansionism that swept over Europe. They went to the Canary Islands and made numerous stops on the mainland below the Sahara Desert. Making contacts with black chiefs and looking into the possibility of establishing trade relations. They carried black Africans back to Europe, and by the time of the death of Prince Henry the Navigator in 1460, it was estimated that 700 or 800 black slaves were being carried annually from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. There, black slaves worked in banking houses, shipyards, and mercantile establishments. They also labored as deckhands, domestic servants, artisans, stevedores, skilled craftsmen, and on the large estates evacuated by the Moors. In fact, slaves were so common in the city of Seville in 1474 that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella nominated a celebrated black, Juan de Valladolid, as the mayoral of the Negroes in that city. Thus, it is not surprising that from the very beginning of Spain's exploits in the New World, blacks from Spain came as explorers, laborers, artisans, and servants, free as well as slave. Among the crew members who sailed with Christopher Columbus, Pedro Alonso Nino was alleged to have been black. Even if Nino was not black, however, irrefutable evidence exists that many blacks accompanied other European explorers, especially Spanish and Portuguese, to the New World and aided them in the discovery, exploration, and colonization of the West Indies and North and South America. Blacks were with Juan Ponce de Leon, who discovered Florida while searching for the mythical Fountain of Youth in 1513. In that same year, 30 blacks sailed with Vasco Nunez de Balboa when he discovered the Pacific Ocean. We know that Hernando Cortez brought blacks with him into Mexico in 1519, and one of them, it has been claimed, was responsible for planting and harvesting the first wheat crop in the New World. At least 200 blacks were with explorer Pedro de Alvarado when he sought to secure control of Quito in 1534 to 1535. Blacks accompanied Panfilo de Narvaez on his ill-fated expedition in 1527 through the southeastern United States and continued with Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, Narvaez's successor who crossed Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Francisco Pizarro also brought blacks with him on his Peruvian expedition in 1535. In 1525, blacks not only aided Don Pedro de Valdivia in conquering Chile, they were also part of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado's exploration of the American Southwest in search of the fabled seven cities of Cibola in 1540. Thus, during the 16th century, when Spain's power seemed beyond challenge as a result of conquistadors carrying Spanish dominion as far as California to the west, Florida to the east, and as far south as Cape Horn, blacks, free and slave, played an active role in the exploration and settlement of the New World. One of the outstanding black explorers of the Narvaez de Vaca expedition was Estevanico, an Arab Negro from Azamur on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, who accompanied the original Narvaez party on its departure from Spain to the New World. As an explorer, Estevanico became the first non Native American to travel across the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. The search for riches and the human labor with which to extract it added a new dimension to the demand for slaves in the New World. To meet this demand, which arose partly from the enslavement and near extermination of the Native Americans, black slavery was introduced into the New World in 1501. At first, most of the black laborers were trained and baptized in Spain before being transported across the Atlantic Ocean. But beginning in 1513, they were brought directly from Africa. 4 years later, at the special behest of Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas, Spaniards immigrating to the New World were allowed to import 12 black slaves, each in an effort to further encourage colonization. The importation of blacks to the New World remained gradual until the last decades of the 16th century when the demand suddenly outgrew the supply. In 1593, Spain gave Pedro Gomez Reynal, in return for 900,000 ducats, the exclusive privilege of importing 38,250 slaves into its colonies in the New World. The agreement stated that the slaves were to be delivered at an annual rate of 4,250, of which at least 3,500 were to be landed alive. They were ordered to be fresh from Africa, and mulattoes, Turks, and Moors were unacceptable. From census records made in the 18th and 19th centuries, we know that thousands of blacks were imported into Spanish colonies in the New World beginning in the late 1500s. In the Rio de la Plata, estuary of the Parana and Uruguay rivers between Argentina and Uruguay, Buenos Aires, and Montevideo were major slave ports in colonial days, averaging about 2,500 arrivals annually around the turn of the 19th century. An 1803 census of Montevideo indicates that the black and mulatto population, slave and free, was 1,040 out of a population of 4,726. Accurate estimates of the black and mulatto population of Buenos Aires during the colonial period are unavailable, but it must have been sizable, for in 1827 the city had 7 established African religious and social societies. At the end of the 18th century, Chile, Spain's outpost on the Pacific, had approximately 30,000 blacks and mulattoes out of a population of half a million. This was two-thirds larger than the native born white European population of Chile. Within the Viceroyalty of Peru, which straddled the Andes and included much of the Pacific coast of South America, it was estimated in 1799 that there were 130,000 blacks. In the late 16th century, the city of Lima had a black slave population of about 15,000, as compared to 2,000 Spaniards, and in 1839, there were an estimated 17,431 slaves and 71,104 part Negroes in the department of Lima. In the presidency of Quito, the present day Ecuador, an estimate in the early 19th century placed the number of blacks and mulattoes at 50,000 in a total population of 600,000. The Viceroyalty of New Granada, now modern Colombia, possessed a large black population because of extensive placer mining, agriculture, and domestic service. In 1810, the black population of New Granada, including the Isthmus of Panama, was estimated to be 210,000 in a total population of 1.4 million. The Captaincy General of Venezuela, which in the 19th century occupied essentially the same areas as the modern republic, contained the largest black as the modern republic contained the largest black population in all Spanish America in Venezuela. Wow. In 1810, there were an estimated 493,000 blacks and mulattoes, free and slave, in a population of about 900,000. Although Spain was engrossed in extracting wealth from the New World, the plan to find a suitable northern passage to the Orient, the legendary Strait of Anian, was not abandoned. Commissioned by King Charles V of Spain after his conquest of Mexico, Cortes renewed the search. According to Cortes, the strait could best be discovered by launching exploratory voyages to the north and west from the west coast of Mexico. After building a shipyard on the Pacific coast of Zacatula, Mexico, in the mid 1520s, he supervised the construction of several vessels, and between 1527 and 1539 sponsored numerous expeditions skirting the west coast of Mexico. While they did not succeed in finding the legendary Northwest Passage, these voyages resulted in the discovery of the peninsula of Baja California, at the time believed to be an island. Cor- Cortez took possession of the territory in the name of the King of Spain, and the search for the Northwest Passage continued with galleons now plying the east and west coast of Baja California as well as the west coast of Mexico. The shipyard construction of Zacatula was an incredible feat considering the fact that all of the ironworks and rigging for the ships were brought overland from the Atlantic port of Veracruz on the backs of blacks, Indians, and pack animals. In the early 1540s, numerous sea and land explorations continued Cortez's search for the Strait of Anian. One important voyage was that of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, who during 1542 to 1543 sailed from Navidad, Mexico, up the west coast of California and possibly as far north as the Rogue River in Oregon. It was on this voyage on September 28, 1542, that Cabrillo's ship entered San Diego Bay, and so this day marks the discovery of Alta, California. Alta meaning upper. Sailing from the Bay of San Diego, Cabrillo visited the Channel Islands and anchored in nearly every large harbor on the mainland, noting the character of the country and the customs of the Indians and naming most of the important coastal landmarks as far north as Point Concepcion. After the mid 1550s, Spain continued to dispatch expeditions to Alta California, not for the purpose of discovering the Northwest Passage, but in order to locate a suitable port which would offer the Manila galleons protection from foreign privateers and interpolers as they carried rich treasures from the Philippine Islands. The explorations of Francisco de Gali, 1584, Sebastian Rodriguez Sermendo, 1595, and Sebastian Vizcaino, 1602, did not bring about immediate colonization of Alta California, even though Vizcaino and Father Ascension, the official diarist of the Vizcaino expedition, saw in Monterrey the long sought harbor for the Manila galleons and an ideal site for a Spanish colony. After the Vizcaino expedition, little additional knowledge was gained about Alta California. Between 1602 and 1769, no Spanish ship was known to have entered Alta California waters from the south. Spanish viceroys in New Spain, as the Mexican territory was called, were lukewarm toward proposals for colonizing Alta California, especially after Anglo Spanish tensions began to decrease and there was less danger to the Manila galleons. Returning home to the west coast of Mexico, the ships turned southward immediately after land was sighted. Thus, colonization of Alta California did not seem expedient. Were blacks involved in the search for the Strait of Anian, the voyages of the Manila galleons, and the search for a suitable port in Alta California? We probably will never know for certain. The fact that blacks were crew members in most of the early Spanish voyages to the New World adds weight to the probability that they took part in these later explorations. Furthermore, after the West Indian islands were colonized, blacks participated in expeditions that departed from the islands to explore and colonize the mainland. The role of non whites in the expansion of the Spanish Empire in the New World is an important one, for without them, it would have been virtually impossible for Spain to explore, exploit, and colonize the New World. There were few European Spaniards in this region, and therefore the expeditionary forces depended upon the extensive use of Native Americans, blacks, mulattoes, and people of other mixed bloods. Christianized blacks and mulattoes who spoke Spanish were especially useful in supervising Native Americans and in establishing missions, towns, and forts. In 1760, most of the troops along the northern frontier of the Spanish Empire, especially in Texas, were blacks, mulattoes, mestizos, and Native Americans. By 1765, primarily as a result of Russian encroachments upon Spain's Pacific domains, French and Dutch efforts to gain a foothold on the Pacific coast, and the Seven-Year War with England, the attitude of the Spanish authority toward Alta California had changed. The Inspector General of New Spain, Jose de Galvez, an ardent expansionist, began to develop comprehensive plans for the further exploration and colonization of Alta California. Under the leadership of Fray Junipero Serra and Don Gaspar de Portola, both charged with occupying and settling parts of California. The missions of San Diego, 1769, and Carmel, 1770, were founded. By 1823, 21 missions had been established, forming a chain from San Diego to Sonoma. To accomplish this, the existing settlements in New Spain, which extended in an arc from the Red River in Louisiana to northern Mexico and Baja California, were called on to supply church ornaments, sacred vessels, cattle, horses, mules, foodstuffs, and men. The Baja California settlements, especially, being closest, made significant contributions to the mission, building, and settlement of Alta California. When Baja California was colonized in the early 1700s, a number of blacks moved across the Gulf of California from Mexico. By 1790, as a result, the population of Baja California included 844 Spanish-speaking persons, of whom 183 were mulattoes, 418 were castas, persons of unclassified mixed ancestry, and 243 were Espanol. The northern settlements of New Spain, especially those in Sonora, Sinaloa, and Baja California, all had a large percentage of blacks and mulattoes. Thus, it is not surprising that the Portola Serra expedition included at least one mulatto soldier and several mulatto mule drivers. The 1774 and 1775 expeditions of Juan Bautista de Anza, which blazed an overland route from Sonora in northern Mexico to California and selected sites for the Presidio and two missions at Fort Point, Arroyo de los Dolores, and Santa Clara, included many mulatto soldiers and servants. Blacks also played a significant role in the founding of early California towns. Of the first 46 settlers of California's second civic pueblo, founded September 4th, 1781, Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciúncula, shortened to Los Angeles, blacks and mulattoes numbered 26. Recruited from Sinaloa in Mexico, the black settlers of the pueblo soon began to replace their crude huts with adobe houses, and in 1784 laid the foundations for a church and several public buildings. 2 years later, they were issued deeds to the land by the Spanish government. One mulatto settler, Francisco Reyes, was elected to serve as alcalde during the 1790s. In other early California towns, blacks and mulattoes constituted a large percentage of the population. In Santa Barbara, they were at least 19.3% of the population in 1785. San Jose, California's first civic pueblo, founded in 1777, possessed a population that was at least 24.3% mulatto and 59.5% non Spanish in 1790. In that same year, blacks and mulattoes were 18.5% of the settlers in Monterrey, then the Spanish capital of California. In 1772, San Francisco's military garrison was at least 18% black and mulatto, and in 1790, blacks and mulattoes constituted almost 15% of the total San Francisco population. At the close of the 18th century, blacks and mulattoes comprised about 20% of the total population of settlers and soldiers residing in California. While most of the black and mulatto settlers of California were free men and women, a few were convicts who were sent to the frontier to serve out their sentences, and a small number were slaves. While the king was the ultimate authority in all matters pertaining to the governing of the vast Spanish Empire, the policy making body for Spain's colonial system in the New World was the Council of the Indies. The New World colonies were divided into viceroyalties, provinces, audiencias, and minor subdivisions. The viceroyalty of New Spain, which included the province of Baja and Alta California, under the designation of Las Californias, was governed from Mexico City by a viceroy who appointed provincial governors. Until 1775, the provincial government of Las Californias was located in Loreto, in Baja California. On August 16, 1775, however, the seat of government was moved by royal decree to Monterrey in Alta California. A provincial legislature called the deputation was appointed by the governor and presided over by him when it convened once every 4 years. Between legislative sessions, the viceroy decreed policy concerning the province. On the local level, the ayuntamiento, town council, managed the civic pueblo's affairs. The judiciary consisted of a number of justices of the peace, individuals who also served as mayors. The alcaldes settled minor disputes by the accepted civil law procedure and conciliation, while serious offenses and appeals were heard by the governor. The offices of alcalde and ayuntamiento member were non paying positions appointed by the governor, who also had the power to remove his own appointees from office. The expansion of Spain's colonial empire in the New World was believed justified by three major achievements: the conversion of the conversion to Christianity of some 100,000 heathen Native Americans, the discovery of rich minerals, and the successful countering of the threat posed by Russian expansion into Alaska and English exploration of the Pacific Northwest. Consequently, conse- consequently, in 1769, plans were formulated for the establishment of a network of presidios, missions, and pueblos in Alta California. Regulations were adopted regarding the founding of settlements, granting public lands, the manner in which the work in the settlements was to be carried out, and the rules to be observed by the military personnel. It was expected that the pueblos would become self supporting and furnish the presidios and missions with necessary food, supplies, and recruits. The colonists were to be given building sites within the pueblos and other land for cultivation and pasture. They would also have free access to common lands. Other incentives offered to attract colonists to Alta California were livestock and farming equipment. The colonists were expected to abide by the rules, controlling their wealth, the distribution of food and supplies to the missions and presidios, and the creation of of a militia and appointment or election of municipal officials. The task of colonizing Alta California was an extremely difficult one, and it would not have been successful without extraordinary effort. As it was, wholesale colonization failed, though the population of the pueblos increased somewhat with births and the arrival of disabled and retired soldiers from the presidios. Only a few Spanish settlers took advantage of the incentives, and those who did became lethargic under the California sun, turning to the Indians to work their fields in return for food and shelter. The missions, on the other hand, prospered under the autocratic rule of the padres and the slave labor of the indigenous Native Americans. They grew in number and prosperity until each one possessed an imposing church, accommodations for the neophytes, Native Americans who had been baptized and lived at the missions, spacious living quarters for the padres, picturesque gardens and buildings where cloth, clothing, tallow, soap, oil, hemp bricks, wine, flour, and bread were made. Cattle and sheep covered the hills adjacent to the missions, and the natural increase of horses was so great many had to be slaughtered because of insufficient grazing land. Thus, the missions became feudal estates, exercising a virtual monopoly over agriculture and industry in the province. The military forces, consisting of about 100 garrisons to begin with, were stationed in the presidios and charged with the duty of securing the pueblos against Indian attack and defending Alta California against foreign invasion. Each presidio had a resident comandante who had jurisdiction over the surrounding territory to ensure protection and enforcement of regulations at the missions, which operated under the authority of Padre Junipero Serra. A detachment of 4 or 5 soldiers was stationed at each mission. Communication was infrequent between Spain and its New World colonies, especially the most distant one of Alta California, which required ocean voyages of unusual length and difficulty to reach. Except for the annual supply ship from San Blas, Mexico, and an occasional visit from a Manila galleon or New England trading or whaling vessel, Alta California had no means of hearing from the outside world. Spain's policies of opposing the entrance of foreign vessels into the Pacific Ocean, prohibiting trade between Alta California and other countries, and the permanent closing of the overland trade route from Sonora, Mexico to Alta California in 1781 seriously retarded the development of Alta California for years and also imposed severe hardship on the settlers. Most of the food products which California now yields in abundance were not to be found in the province during the early years of the Spanish era. There were no domestic animals and none of the tools and utensils necessary for the work that had to be done if the colonists were to survive. Thus, everything that was needed had to be brought from existing settlements in New Spain, primarily those in Mexico. Lists of supplies provided by the central government in Mexico for the settlers of San Francisco show how completely the colonists depended on outside assistance. Besides, Besides the absolutely necessary items of arms, horses, mules, cattle, and rations for the soldiers, the men were given shirts, underwear, jackets, breeches, hose, buckskin boots and shoes, caps, hats, and ribbons for their hats, and to tie up their queues. In addition, spurs, bridle and bit, saddle and cushion, and leather jacket were added to each man's allowance. Women were provided with chemises, petticoats, jackets, undergarments, shoes, stockings, hats, and ribbons. Children received the necessary garments, and each family was allowed additional household utensils. After the establishment of the settlements, the central government was expected to continue to send food and other necessities until the colonists became self sufficient. Unfortunately, the annual supply ships, which were virtually the sole support of the province during its early settlement, were not dependable. Alta California was barely saved in 1770 and again in 1772 and 1774. Shortages of vital supplies continued throughout the Spanish era, and only with the evolution of an illicit foreign trade were the settlers able to obtain provisions regularly. The destitution of the early Californians, the great need for clothing, furniture, tools, and other necessities caused the Spanish governors of the province to wink at the illegal trade. Thanks to the ranchos and missions, there was some food, while the Russians at Fort Ross, 20 miles north of San Francisco, supplied shoes and clothing. During the years of the rebellion of the colonies against Spain, 1810 to 1826, when the supply ships were stopped altogether, American vessels engaged in a flourishing contraband business with the settlements along the coast. The failure of Spain to develop Alta California into a strong populous colony was in part a consequence of imperialistic policies in Europe. Seeking possessions in Italy and the Low Countries involved Spain in continuous wars, requiring enormous expeditions and thousands of soldiers. The result was that few resources were expended on the development of the colonies in the New World, especially Alta California, whose affairs were regarded as less important than those of Europe. These were the conditions prevailing in the province in 1810, when Spain's New World colonies began the rebellion that would culminate in Mexico's independence 11 years later. Although Alta Californians took no active part in the revolt and generally did not receive news of the fierce battles in the South until long after they occurred, they were compelled to suffer the consequences. At the start of the revolution, the Spanish speaking population of Alta California numbered little more than 3,000, 2,000 of whom were soldiers and their families, priests, and the people employed at or living near the missions. Fewer than 1,000 persons were residents of pueblos and ranchos. The populations of San Jose and San Francisco, the only two towns of any numerical importance, had risen to 240 and 615 respectively. By now, no supply ships were arriving and the pay of the soldiers and public officials had stopped. The Spanish governors constantly petitioned the viceroy for assistance and relief, but he could do little because the funds of the viceroyalty, especially after 1810, were directed to the suppression of the revolution that was occurring in various parts of New Spain. The comandantes in Alta California were ordered to collect bows and arrows, and the padres were required to pack and conceal the mission valuables, drive the livestock into the interior, and keep their vaqueros armed and ready in case of hostilities. In February 1821, Mexico proclaimed its independence from Spain, the news reaching Alta California in January 1822. In March of that year, authoritative confirmation came, and Provincial Governor Pablo Vicente Sola met with military and missionary leaders to take the oath of allegiance to the new government. After a series of events in which revolutionary leader Augustine Iturbide was proclaimed emperor, followed by his abdication, trial, and execution, the Republic of Mexico was established on November 19th, 1823, under a constitution closely resembling that of the United States. Again, Alta Californians accepted the change of government without struggle or protest from civilians, military, or clergy. The relationship between Alta California and the new central government, however, was even weaker than it had been with Spain. Communication remained difficult, and serious Indian uprisings and internal strife between factions in the province met with apparent indifference and neglect on the part of the Mexican government. Given these chaotic conditions and the native Alta Californians' dislike of the Spanish and Mexican governors, resentment grew. Soon, the overriding public sentiment was for complete independence, reflecting not only dissatisfaction with Mexican rule, but the influence of the ideals of liberty and equality expounded by the philosophers of the French Revolution. All right, y'all, that's the end of the first chapter of California's Black Pioneers.
You're at 109 right now.